I had decided to pretend to be dead and not draw any attention to myself. I laid there and I could hear their last breaths being taken.
When the shooting happened, the library was chaos. Gunfire, screams, bodies collapsing. Craig Scott lay still, covered in his friend's blood, pretending to be dead. Hours earlier, he'd fought with his sister, Rachel, not knowing that he'd never get to apologize. These are some of the most disturbing interviews with Columbine survivors.
Authorities in Littleton, Colorado are securing the scene of a deadly school shooting so they can make a final body count as the community and the nation struggles to come to grips with the carnage.
April 20th, 1999. For most students at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, it was just another Tuesday. Seniors were counting down the days to graduation, juniors were stressing over finals, and the lunch bell was minutes away. But at 11:19 a.m., everything changed. Gunfire shattered the silence, chaos erupted, and in just under an hour, Columbine would become a name that the world would never forget. Because by the time everything was over, 12 students and a teacher were dead, 24 others were injured, and 2 gunmen, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, had turned the school into a war zone before taking their own lives. For years, the story was simple. 2 bullied outcasts finally snapped, seeking revenge on their classmates who tormented them. That narrative took hold almost instantly. The media ran with it, anti-bullying campaigns used it as their rallying cry, and Hollywood turned it into a recurring theme.
We must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send, often before they explode into violence.
But here's the thing, it wasn't true. Columbine wasn't just a school shooting. It was supposed to be a bombing. And if things did go according to plan, it would have been one of the deadliest terrorist attacks on U.S. soil.
Oh, that's a slug. Imagine that in someone's brain.
Eric Harris wasn't some socially awkward loner who got pushed too far. This guy was calculating, manipulative, and full of hate. He wrote pages upon pages in his journal about how much he despised humanity, how he wanted to watch people suffer, not just specific bullies, but everyone. Dylan Klebold, on the other hand, was a little different. He was more emotional, depressed, and self-destructive, always looking for some type of meaning. In his journal, he wouldn't write just about violence, but about love, about longing for escape, about feeling lost in his own mind. He wanted out. Columbine, for him, was a way to end it all.
The 2 gunmen who went on the rampage booby-trapped the building and even themselves. Specially trained officers searching the school today found close to 30 explosive devices all around the building.
Their original plan was horrifying. 2 massive propane bombs hidden in the cafeteria. They were set to detonate at lunch hour, when the cafeteria was packed with hundreds of students. If that worked, these bombs would have leveled the school, killing over 400 people in an instant. Then, as survivors ran for their lives, Harris and Klebold would be waiting outside, gunning them down. And if that wasn't enough, they also had car bombs in the parking lot, ready to detonate just as first responders arrived, taking even more lives. But this plan failed. The bombs didn't go off. The 2 of them waited for a while. Nothing happened, and that's when they switched to Plan B. Guns. At 11:19 a.m., the first gunshots rang out. The 2 of them started outside, firing at students in the parking lot before storming in the school in their black trench coats. They shot at random, not targeting bullies, not looking for revenge. They just wanted as much destruction as possible. In the library, where many students were hiding, they began toying with their victims. They laughed, cracked jokes, and made students beg for their lives before pulling the trigger.
After they'd shoot up something, they'd go, woo! Just a pleasure for them.
But then something changed. Halfway through this massacre, they stopped. Instead of continuing their rampage, they wandered the hallways almost aimlessly. Survivors later said it was like they had lost momentum, like they'd expected something bigger, and when it didn't happen, they didn't know what to do. At 12:08 p.m., the 2 of them would go back to the library, sit down, and shoot themselves in the head. The world scrambled for answers. Why did they do it? What drove two suburban teenagers to commit mass murder in Colorado? The easiest explanation, the one that took hold immediately, was that they were bullied, that they had been tormented to the point of snapping, that they had been rejected, humiliated, and finally had enough. And well, that was a comforting idea. If it was about bullying, that meant that there's a simple solution. How about being kinder to each other, watching out for warning signs, and just like that, you can prevent another Columbine. But it's never that simple. The reality was that Harris and Klebold weren't bullied outcasts. They had friends, social lives, even jobs. They went to parties. They weren't targeting bullies. They just wanted to kill as many people as possible. And the worst part? This could have been prevented. A year before the attack, Harris posted detailed death threats online. He would brag about making pipe bombs. A police report was even filed. There was even enough evidence to get a search warrant, which would have led authorities straight to his growing arsenal of weapons and explosives. But that search warrant was never signed. Had it gone through, Columbine may have never happened. Instead, the world got a tragedy. A school that became a symbol, and survivors who have spent decades trying to make sense of the horror they lived through. Because for them, April 20th, 1999 never really ended. And these are some of their stories. That fateful April day, Casey Johnson was sitting in the library at Columbine High School during lunch. She almost never stayed there during lunch. Most days, she and her mom ate lunch together at home. But that day, for some reason still unknown to her, she decided to stay at the school. She had no idea that in just a few minutes her life would change forever. At 11:19 a.m., she heard the first gunshots, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the doors burst open. And then all she could hear was laughter, yelling, and the sound of boots moving across the floor. She barely had any time to react before she dived under a computer desk. She could hear the shooters moving through the library, picking targets at random. She didn't know them, and they didn't know her. But she was in their way, and that made her a target.
The bullet came in back here and left a big hole, shattered this whole third of my arm, and came out the front.
The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She collapsed, unable to move, struggling to breathe. But she did the only thing she could to survive.
There was no mercy from the shooters. He yelled at me after he shot me, and I thought he'd shoot me again. So I closed my eyes and pretended to be dead.
When Casey had woken up in the hospital, she'd barely survived. The damage to her arm was so bad that the doctors weren't sure how they could save it. Amputation was on the table, and then somebody mentioned tissue donation. Her family didn't hesitate. Even if it meant she had a chance of keeping her arm, it was worth it. The surgery was a success. Doctors used donated bone from a stranger to reconstruct her shoulder and hand. She never regained complete mobility, but she had both her arms, and that was enough. Now, for a while after the surgery, Casey kept battling severe PTSD, nightmares, and the emotional scars of that day. Then, 5 years after Columbine, something happened that changed everything. Casey was invited to ride on the Donate Life float at the Rose Parade, which honored organ and tissue donors and recipients. And she spent the weekend surrounded by people who had given or received the ultimate gift. And for the first time, she thought about the person who had saved her arm, instead of the shooters that had changed her life. She realized that her survival wasn't just about her. It was about the person who had given her a second chance. Now, she started sharing her story, not just about Columbine, but about tissue donation, PTSD, and finding purpose in pain. One day after a speaking event, someone in the audience asked her,
"Did the bone donation save your life?"
Her first instinct was to say no. It didn't keep her heart beating. It didn't pull her out of that library that day. But when she thought about it, what is life? To her, life is holding the hands of her 4 children. It's hugging them with both arms when they come home from school. It's holding a book in one hand and a child in the other. And in that moment, she realized, yes, it did save her life. Casey knows the scars from that day will always be there, but instead of dwelling on it, she calls them her tattoos of survival. And for Casey, survival isn't just about making it through the day. It's about finding meaning. It's about honoring the people who never got a second chance. And it's about choosing to live fully every single day. And this is what she keeps telling herself.
You will learn to use your story as a public speaker and author to encourage others and to advocate for bone and tissue donation.
On the day of the shooting, Heather Martin was a senior at Columbine, sitting in her choir class, just going through another normal day. Then a student ran up the stairs out of breath, panicked, shouting,
"Someone's shooting downstairs."
Heather barely had time to process those words before the first gunshots rang out.
So everybody just kind of ran if they could get out, and for whatever reason I didn't run. I think I was just in shock.
She and 59 other students crammed into their choir teacher's tiny office, barricading the door behind them. The space was too small. It got hot, stuffy, and unbearable. So much so that some students climbed onto desks, removing the ceiling tiles just to breathe. The students tried calling 911, but the lines were busy, so they waited and waited.
We talked about dying. We talked about the things that we wouldn't be able to do because we were going to die.
When the SWAT team finally arrived, Heather and her classmates were led out of the school, past broken glass, overturned desks, and unimaginable horror. But what waited for them outside was just the beginning of another nightmare. In the weeks and months following the attack, the media was still running with the convenient story that the shooters were bullied and that this was their revenge. But Heather, like so many others, knew that wasn't the truth. Now, she knew this because one of the shooters had asked her friend to homecoming. The girl said no, and he bullied her so badly that she almost dropped out of school. But for so long, Heather had to watch while the rest of the world sympathized with the shooters and even turned survivors into villains. In a 2004 interview with the Oracle newspaper, she said,
"A friend of mine wore a Columbine sweatshirt 5 days after the shooting. She just wanted to get away to clear her head, but people spit on her. They told her it was her fault, that we deserved it."
And the harassment never stopped. Years later, survivors still receive horrible messages online like,
"You should have died,"
and
"I'm coming to finish the job."
Meanwhile, the shooters have been idolized by some, their faces used as profile pictures, their names worn like some badge of honor. Even now, 25 years later, Heather still gets texts from people who think they know what really happened. They don't.
I thought I should be over it. Actually, I thought I should be over it after 1 month. And after 3 months, I was surprised that I was still feeling the after effects of trauma.
After graduation, Heather tried moving on. She went to college and told herself that she was fine, but she wasn't. She once said,
"As a physically uninjured survivor, I felt I had no right to be traumatized. I wasn't shot, I didn't lose a loved one, but I saw the aftermath. They didn't cover the bodies as we were let out."
So she did what many trauma survivors do. She pushed it down, and she developed an eating disorder, which turned into recreational drug use. And then she would convince herself that it was all normal college behavior, but deep down, she was terrified and she knew she was spiraling. Yet, she kept pushing. Then, 10 years after Columbine, she was asked to pull out her high school yearbook during an interview. Inside, she found a message from her English teacher.
"I hope you major in English and become a teacher. Your students will love you."
For some reason, that hit different, and that's when she went back to school. Today, Heather's an English teacher at a Colorado high school.
My kids will ask me, they're like, "So what'll happen? What will you do if it happens here?" And I'm like, "Well, I have a plan. I have a backup plan. I've got a backup plan for my backup plan."
But that's not all. After the 2012 Aurora Theater shooting, she and fellow Columbine survivor Zach Cartea founded the Rebels Project, a support network for survivors of mass violence. Because she knows the truth. Trauma doesn't just go away, and not all therapists truly understand mass violence. And that's why the Rebels Project gives survivors a place to talk about the triggers, interviews, the anxiety of public spaces, and just figuring out how to keep on living. She would also work with law enforcement and the FBI, helping him to understand how to properly respond to mass shootings. She's even spoken at the White House, testified before Congress, and met survivors from Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Parkland, and beyond. But the most meaningful moments for her are the ones where she gets to connect with another survivor, to remind them they're not alone.
You learn that you are not the only person who's hypervigilant. You are not the only person who has nightmares. You're not the only person who hates the sound of helicopters or sirens or fireworks.
Frank DeAngelis never planned on being a principal. At first, he wanted to be an accountant, a nice, steady job with numbers, no surprises. But then someone told him something that stuck. Find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. That changed everything. He became a teacher, then a coach, then eventually the principal of Columbine High School, and he loved it. He once said,
"I even loved cafeteria duty because it meant I got to be with the kids."
For 20 years, Columbine was his second home. And then on April 20th, 1999, it became something else entirely. The morning felt pretty normal, until his secretary burst into his office panicked and outright told him,
"There's report of gunfire."
Frank's mind couldn't process this. He initially thought it had to be a senior prank, but then he stepped into the hallway, and his worst nightmare unfolded in front of him. Gunshots, breaking glass, and screams filling the hallways. Then he saw one of the shooters, and he turned to Frank with the barrel of a shotgun that looked like the size of a cannon, as Frank himself recalled.
And I went through something that I learned later was fight, flight, and freeze. And everything just seemed to slow down, and I was thinking out loud what was it going to feel like to have a bullet pierce my body?
At that moment, he thought it was over. But then something happened. Coach Dave Sanders ran up the hallway. The gunman turned his attention to Dave, giving Frank just enough time to run. Frank raced toward the gym, where 20 girls had just come out of class. They ran for a storage room, their only way out. But the door was locked. Frank yanked on it, desperately searching his pocket. A ring with 30 keys in his hand. He tried one. It worked, thank God, on the first try. That's something he'll never forget because later, every single one of those girls made it out safely. And that key still hangs on Frank's wall in his office. Most people wouldn't have blamed Frank if he had left after that day. But Frank had made a promise to himself that he wouldn't leave until every student in the district that day had graduated. That meant staying 13 more years, until the preschoolers of 1999 walked across the stage in 2012. And he did, even on the hardest days.
The event changed me immensely. Each morning when I wake up, I recite the names of the beloved 13.
2014, Frank finally retired, but his work didn't stop. Every time another school shooting happens, his phone rings. Sandy Hook, Parkland, Santa Fe, Uvalde.
Parkland took me back to Columbine because of the images, with the kids running with their hands on their head, what I called the Columbine March, and it took me back.
He's been there for every principal who's faced the same horror he did. He once said,
"It takes something out of me, but if I can help someone else, then it's worth it."
He still goes to therapy, still struggles with PTSD, and still carries a small touchstone in his pocket, something to hold on to when the memories creep in. It's engraved with a simple phrase. This isn't April 20th, 1999. Because for Frank, healing isn't a destination, it's a choice, one he makes every single day.
And I can remember distinctly telling the students that people will tell you that time will heal all wounds, but I said the scars that we experienced yesterday will last for a lifetime.
April 20th, 99. McKay Hall was sitting in Columbine's library, just like any other day. Then he heard it, the gunfire. But before he could react, bullets ripped through his table.
First volley hit my right leg and the side of my face and my chest.
At first, Hall was confused. Then he was consumed by pain and terror as he tried to make sense of his injuries and what was still happening around him. But everything was happening so fast, too fast. Next to him, his friend Patrick lifted his head, maybe to check on others, maybe just trying to make sense of the chaos. And in that moment, Hall watched his friend get shot in the head. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Forever. For a long time, McKay was angry.
That I couldn't get over the fact that I had gone through something and I felt like the world owed me something.
He couldn't escape that day, no matter how hard he tried. Certain sounds like fire alarms, breaking glass, loud bangs would instantly take him back. And even when the world moved on, he felt stuck. But eventually, little by little, he started to rebuild. It wasn't easy. It took time, years even. But he got there. McKay became a nurse. It wasn't something he'd always planned, but after that shooting, he spent so much time in hospitals, watching nurses, doctors, and caregivers.
And I remember, admiring healthcare personnel and providers, and always thought that that was something that, I could possibly do.
Now, at UC Health in Aurora, he's the one comforting others. He knows what helplessness feels like, to be in pain, to survive something unimaginable.
Violence, happens in many people's lives. It's an unfortunate thing. And part of the comfort that I think some of the patients that I've had have experienced is that there's a common thread.
Today, McKay is married and a father to 3 beautiful girls. He told them the truth about what happened to him, that when he was a boy at school, someone shot him. His daughters would be angry, confused, hurt. They wanted to know why, but he reassured them, told them that it wouldn't happen to them.
I don't want to transmit my fear onto them. I wish they could live like I did before Columbine.
Because that's what healing really is. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but choosing to move forward anyway. And if there's one thing he wants other survivors to know, it's this.
It's not hopeless. That there's a way to kind of come back to the light.
Lance Kirkland walks out of the cafeteria at Columbine for a quick smoke with 2 friends. It was supposed to be a normal day. Then they saw him. 2 figures standing at the top of the stairs, dressed in trench coats, guns in their hands. At first, Lance thought it was a joke, maybe a senior prank. Then the gunfire started.
I started paining my foot, and then seconds later, maybe at the same time, my knee felt like it went out, and then this knee got hurt, and then it felt like somebody punched me in the chest.
Lance watched as his friend, Dan Rorbo, collapsed and didn't get back up. Then Lance hit the ground, dazed, bleeding, barely able to move. And that's when Dylan Claybold walked up to him. Lance, struggling to breathe, whispered for help.
He said, "Sure, I'll help you," and I looked up a little bit, and he didn't grab my hand, and so I just laid back down, and he put the shotgun right behind my ear and pulled the trigger.
And just like that, Dylan was gone, and Lance was left for dead after shooting him 5 times. But somehow, Lance was still holding on. Now, Lance doesn't really remember much after that, but the doctors do. When he arrived at Denver Health Medical Center, they didn't think he'd make it. His jaw was blown apart. His chest, groin, leg, and foot were full of bullets. A shotgun pellet had even lodged itself near his heart. One of his surgeons even admitted late on that he thought Lance had no chance. But Lance refused to die. He spent 2 weeks in the ICU, underwent 30 hours of surgery, and had to learn to walk all over again. At one point, he tries to take a sip of his apple juice, only for it to leak through a hole in his face. But through it all, Lance kept going. Surviving was just the first battle. The aftermath was a whole different kind of fight. Lance became one of the most recognizable Columbine survivors. News cameras followed him. Aerosmith dedicated a concert to him. Celebrities reached out. Donations flooded in, and all his medical bills were covered. He was also given a trust fund, a new house, even a purebred Labrador retriever at a discount because of his name.
My friends and I were in the first group that got shot, so we didn't really know what was going on. I had no idea how big of a story it was.
It should have been a dream, but it wasn't. Lance later admitted that his classmates resented him. Some thought he was enjoying the attention too much, but later he realized he'd been taken advantage of.
An hour interview, and it lasted for almost 3 hours. And then they would cut it all down to, 30 seconds of me talking and spin my words. And that really showed me as a kid what people are really like.
Even his relationship with his dad, Mike, started to crack. Mike had been his rock, the one who held his hand through every surgery, every painful step toward recovery. But as Lance healed, as he tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy, he realized something. His parents should have protected him more. Looking back, he wishes they had shielded him from the media frenzy, the cameras, the constant exposure. Instead, he felt like he was thrown into the spotlight without a choice. His trauma turned into this spectacle for the world to see. At the time, he didn't fully understand it, but as he got older, he started to pull away, realizing just how much had been taken from him.
There's been a lot of things that both my parents have done that really hurt me. And so, it's been recent that I've kind of cut everybody out of my life that isn't positive.
When Lance thinks about that day now, he sees it differently than most would expect. Yeah, he suffered. Yes, he lost friends. And yeah, it hurts in every possible way. But if you ask him if he could change what happened to him, he shakes his head. After all, he's still here, and his story has helped others and inspired many. And because Columbine taught him something most people never learn, he once said in this interview,
"Everybody dies. The measure is how you live your life. It just wasn't my number yet."
Shawn Thomas Graves.
In 2002, when Shawn Graves walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the entire room erupted in applause. For most students, it wasn't just a high school graduation. For Shawn, it was proof that he'd beaten the odds. 3 years earlier, they told him he might never walk again. He was paralyzed from the waist down after being shot 6 times during the Columbine shooting. But Shawn was never one to accept limits placed on him. It all started when Shawn was a freshman, hanging out with his friends, Lance Kirkland and Danny Rorbo. They just finished lunch and were headed outside before their next class. Danny hadn't really wanted to come, but Shawn convinced him. He later said,
"I was stressed about a test and I knew he would get me laughing."
It was such a small decision, one that felt meaningless at that time. But for years, Shawn has blamed himself for it. As they walked, they saw the 2 older students at the top of the stairs. They were holding guns, and Shawn didn't panic, because he thought it was a prank like his friends. Some paintball guns, maybe some kind of senior game. Then they heard the gunfire. Danny was hit first. Shawn turned to look, still confused, still expecting to see paint. Then a bullet grazed his neck. If he hadn't turned at that exact moment, it would have gone straight through his throat.
A bullet entered the side of my backpack, spun around, and actually shot me in the back.
Another bullet hits his spine. Suddenly, he can't move. He collapsed, struggling to breathe, praying for help, praying that he would walk again.
God, I can't walk.
Then sit down.
I don't want to sit down. I gotta do this.
Recovery wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Doctors told Shawn that he would never walk again. If he did, it'd probably be with braces like Forrest Gump. But he wasn't ready to accept that. He spent years in physical therapy, pushing through pain most people cannot imagine. He said,
"I had to learn to crawl again before I could walk."
And when he graduated in 2002, he made a choice. He wasn't rolling across that stage. He was walking.
I knew I wasn't taking that wheelchair out. And against everyone's wishes, I walked out of there.
Now, 25 years later, Shawn has faced a whole new kind of challenge: fatherhood. Becoming a parent has completely changed his perspective. He used to think about Columbine as a survivor. Now, he thinks about it as a dad. He wants to teach his daughter about the evil in this world. He wants her to be aware of the world, but not afraid of it. And he refuses to let fear control his life. In his latest interview, he said,
"I don't want her to grow up afraid. I want her to live. I want her to laugh. I want her to be a kid."
Shawn now works with people who have been newly injured or disabled, helping them adjust, giving them hope. Because if there's one thing he's learned, it's that life moves forward, whether you're ready or not. He always says,
"You can't change what happened, but you can choose how you live after it."
Craig Scott doesn't just remember April 20th, 99. He lives with it every single day. That morning, he and his sister Rachel were running late for school. He was taking too long to get ready, and she was frustrated. They argued in the car, nothing serious, just typical sibling bickering. But as she pulled into the Columbine High School's parking lot, she sighed and said, "I love you," before hurrying off to class. He didn't say it back, and that was the last time he ever saw her.
And the last moment I had with her was I slammed the car door shut on her. No idea that'd be the last time I'd see her.
A few hours later, Craig was in the library when gunfire erupted outside. At first, he thought it was a prank, until his teacher ran in shouting for everyone to get under the tables. He hid with his friends, Isaiah Scholes and Matt Kechter. When the shooters stormed in, they found their hiding spot.
They were mocking students before they shot or killed them, and they treated it like it was a game.
They taunted Isaiah, mocking him for being African American, before they shot both him and Matt. Craig lay still, covered in their blood, pretending to be dead. And somehow the gunman moved on, and when Craig saw an opening, he ran.
And I was so thankful to be alive. But at the same time, I actually felt really bad because I left my friends underneath that table.
As soon as he got out of the school, he knew something was wrong. He called his mom, told her he was okay, but he paused and said,
"But I think something happened to Rachel."
They waited all night for news. Rachel never called. The next morning, police confirmed she'd been the very first victim, shot outside while eating lunch.
My mom came down to tell me the news, and I could see on her face that she was just so worried about me and how I was going to take it.
And just like that, Craig had survived. But he'd lost his sister, his friends, and his sense of safety forever. And for a long time, he was pretty angry. He wanted revenge. But from who? The shooters were already dead, and he kept having these nightmares, replaying the moment over and over again. But then his family found Rachel's journals. She'd written about kindness, about believing in people. One sentence stood out.
"I have this theory that if one person goes out of their way to show compassion, it'll start a chain reaction."
Craig realized he had a choice: stay angry or honor Rachel's message. Now he travels the country sharing her story. His family also started Rachel's Challenge, a nonprofit dedicated to spreading kindness and preventing school violence. They've reached over 29 million students over the years.
My first presentation I did, I was 18, and I'll continue to share as long as I live, as long as it's making an impact on schools.
Craig also mentors survivors of other school shootings. He helps them navigate grief, guilt, and the impossible weight of survival. He said,
"I tell them, forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about setting yourself free. Because if you don't, that anger will destroy you."
It's been over 25 years, but Craig's mission still hasn't changed. Every time he speaks, he hopes someone hears Rachel's words and chooses kindness. Because kindness is a choice, and it always starts with one person.
If she were somehow aware of what has happened with her story and her legacy, and to say, "Nice job, little bro," that would be pretty cool.